People who grew up rich but turned out poor. What is your story? Until I was 10, my family seemed to have an ideal life. Beautiful houses in a very wealthy beachfront town, expensive cars, summer camps, and everything else a kid could want. My dad was a dentist and my mom was just starting work as real estate broker. She said her money was fun money. Dad paid the bills. But unbeknownst to us, Dad didn't pay the bills. He was living a double life with our babysitter. They even had their own house. My parents split and weeks later, the bank took our house. We, my mom and us 3 kids, were out on our asses. My dad has taken whatever was left of the money, not much, and destroyed my mom's credit with bankruptcies and delinquencies she didn't know about. We struggled for many years and had lots of help from family friends. There were many birthdays and holidays with no gifts and lots of pasta for dinner. My mom could stretch $1 pretty well since she had grown up with not much money. Now, 30 years later, my mom has become successful financially through lots of hard work. My dad is still with my old babysitter. He retired. He was forced to sell his practice because of lots of bad business practices, and is now working a minimum wage job and living in near poverty. Went from very well off to middle class. Grew up in Peru. My family was involved in government and acting. We appeared in a few shows. My mom was the face of a detergent brand. My sister was the face of some brand of cereal. I was doing commercials weekly. Being well off in a Latin American country was dangerous in the 90s, still is, you have no idea. My mom had an armored car. We had shared guards with the other houses in my small block. We got followed all the time, robbed at gunpoint. Moving to America to be safe meant losing it all and starting over. We cried in the plane. My mom even worked at Subway with my sister so we could get by. Now we live a nice secure life in Florida and I wouldn't go back. My family used to be similarly targeted by robbers. In 1980s there was a mob group that had attacked our family and killed one of our guards. The guard was old, kind of just like a gatekeeper. He had dreams which he used to share with my dad. His dream was to make his son successful enough to own a house like our family's. He had been with our family for almost 2 decades and was like really trustworthy. A lot of people remember him. We had paid for his son's college and living. Anyway, the robbers, actually murderers, couldn't steal anything, but they were later arrested and executed on orders of my granddad on charges of murder. My granddad was the judge himself. It must have been really satisfying for him to give the verdict. My dad had an oil business. Yeah, he was the judge presiding over that case. It was a panel of 5 judges. Now the rules have changed and it's not allowed. My dad owned several very successful radio stations, then sold them all for several million, while all the mega media companies were buying them up. We lived very comfortably for a while with a nice house and a vacation home right on the slopes of a major Colorado ski resort. He married a gold digger. Unfortunately, he bought it all with money that relied on tech stocks. Then the dot-com bubble burst. We lost everything. He tried to sue his broker for bad advice, but only won about $200,000. He then declared bankruptcy and lost everything again. Our house sold for half of its worth. I have no idea what happened to the vacation home, but I assume something similar. His wife divorced him. My dad, brother, and I all split up to try to make it on our own. He ended up couch surfing with my mom's family while he got a real estate license. He is still paying alimony. My brother and I put ourselves through school and we both have reasonable jobs now and are doing all right. For those asking for details. My mom passed when I was 11. The gold digger was my dad's second wife. Yes, there is a lot of money that was unaccounted for in my story. I was a detached 16-year-old at the time and wasn't interested in the details. I just know he owed a lot of money to a lot of people and didn't have anything to pay them with. My dad is doing fine now. He got his real estate license, got back on his feet, then the housing market tanked and he lost it all again. Now he is semi-retired, working as a manager at a storage facility for more hours than he wants, and living off Social Security in a swanky retirement community. The moral of the story is, if you invest, diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Quite a story. I think it's good to learn these lessons early. My lawyer dad had a partner, and they made great money for years. When I was 12, my dad went on his own and lost everything. Bankruptcy and divorce followed, a terrifying experience. We could no longer afford anything, but maybe it was all for the better. Instead of being spoiled brats, all four of us kids put ourselves through school and all did fine. We are still doing okay. I agree. I was well on my way to being a spoiled rich kid who expected everything to be handed to him. This was a huge wake-up call on how things actually are. Even with everything that happened, I still consider us pretty fortunate. We had family and friends that we were able to lean on to get by and help us all get on our feet. A lot of people don't have that. My grandparents were very wealthy, so they bought my parents a house and basically supported my family, even paying for my school tuition. I wasn't aware of this. Because of this, my parents were lazy and never really had jobs. They were always at home, and I didn't find any of this unusual. We had extravagant vacations, and I remember being given everything I'd ever asked for. But my grandpa died when I was about 10, grandma following suit soon after, and all his kids started fighting over the money. I'm pretty sure they're still fighting. Anyway, soon half the lights in our house didn't work, our TVs were all broken, and our cars broken down and barely usable. I was wearing the same uniform all throughout high school, and as a teenager I wore nothing but hand-me-downs. My allowance decreased instead of increased year by year. There were no more vacations. But my parents wasted the rest of their savings on appearing rich, buying fancy jewelry and clothes for themselves and shit, racking up credit card debt. Then they'd host parties for friends in expensive restaurants, and I'd feel so angry because back home we'd be eating nothing but canned food. It honestly scarred me so much that my only goal is to become financially stable, and I plan to stay employed without ever retiring because I don't want to be like them, jobless and stupid. Ironically, they've probably taught you financial responsibility really well, despite not understanding it themselves. Dad went to jail for housing fraud in 2010. I was in my teens and $10 million were seized. Went from an owner of $800,000 house to homeless in 4 days because our family didn't even know he'd been in court for 2 years. Oh geez. I feel so bad for your family at that time. What was it like after that? Went from ramshackle app to apartment. I was the class clown in all my new schools that went home alone with no real friends. Mainly because I never tried and didn't want people to see where I lived. Got good grades and went to a top 10 college for engineering. Tried to be social to make up for lost time. Joined a frat, got the shit kicked out of me in hazing, and now I'm addicted to nicotine and probably alcohol. We were really well off in Korea until we moved to America. It seemed like a piece of cake for a family like mine to start life anew with enough financial backings. My father had worked hard for his family. In the first 2 years of our life in America, my parents were scammed by shady Korean immigration lawyers. Twice. Blew all of their savings and emergency funds. We started from rock bottom again. I remember skipping 2 meals a day so we could have food to go around everyone. I also remember pulling the plug on the refrigerator because what's the fucking point if there's nothing in it? We don't look back or talk about those times anymore. I grew up rich. I wouldn't say I'm poor, but I don't live near as well as my parents. I grew up in a house which Zillow has now valued at $5 million in a very wealthy area. My mom never worked. My dad had an office and employees, and besides my mom, 3 ex-wives. My grandmother and great-grandfather came from extreme wealth. And really, it just turned out that my dad, though he was pretending for years to run a business, have an office and be a big important person, never actually made any money. All of it was drawn from a trust that had been set aside for him, and finally when it went dry, it was over. When my parents passed, I inherited about $13,000. Meh, that's life. I have 2 siblings that roam the earth thinking there's still something they can capitalize on from all this, some privileged bank of connections they can make withdrawals from. But I've accepted that I'm just ordinary folk. Life doesn't owe me anything. It's a pretty short and simple one. My parents are absolutely loaded. My dad was a VP at a major engineering firm, and while they're retired now, they're sitting on about $4 million in the bank and maybe $12 million in investments and stocks and the like. They're also scumbags. My mother is an abusive monster who beat the shit out of me growing up, and my father is an alcoholic who couldn't stop her. So after college, I made it clear I don't want their money, or anything to do with them. They use money as control, If they're helping pay for something, then they think that gives them broad control over me. So they can go to hell. I've worked for a clean power company my whole adult life, and I've gotten myself to about $60,000 a year. Of course, the pandemic has temporarily turned my job off, but I'm proud of where I've gotten even if it's much lower than how I began. My dad was a millionaire. Cheated on my mom. My mom left him. He had a mental breakdown. Lost everything. Still trying to get her back 10 years later. I grew up in a wealthy part of the United States, and everyone I went to school with had wealthy parents. It's amazing how many of these children are now mediocre at best and not high-income earners. There was an assumption that if they simply went to college, graduated, and got a job, they'd be as successful as their parents. When they weren't, they felt the world was unfair and became apathetic. My parents' neighborhood has homes in the $2 to $20 million range, and about 50% of the houses now have adult children in their 50s living with 80-year-old parents. From birth to about 8 years of age, I lived in Mexico with my parents. My dad was a truck driver in the United States. With the income he was getting, living in Mexico was awesome. We weren't rich. We lived in decent homes and had a decent life. Most of the money went to helping other family, food, and going out. But to me, we lived very good. I don't remember my parents ever stressing about anything financial. Last thing I remember before migrating to the US was the Twin Towers. When we came over, living expenses increased. We lived in my uncle's house in the living room for about a year. After that, we rented a room from a family in a bad area. I remember I couldn't go out the front entrance of the apartments one morning for school, because someone got stabbed. 2 years later, we got our first apartment. We had no furniture whatsoever, no appliances. We each had a box of clothes. That night we had our first dinner. It was Chinese takeout, and we were using an ice chest as a table. Buckets for chairs. We felt happiness and a relief to finally have a place to call our own. It's a beautiful memory for me. My stepdad managed a casino, and my mom was a really well-known real estate agent. Before they separated, their combined salaries was in the millions. My stepdad was very good with saving money and my mom was not. They split up. My mom proceeded to pay cash for a house in an upscale neighborhood. Bought a Porsche, a large truck, dirt bikes, computers, and everything else she wanted that my stepdad told her no for. She started dating young guys and would pay for them to go to Aruba, the Bahamas, Dubai, etc. She was living a very carefree life. Originally, I didn't take work or school seriously as a teenager because I was essentially spoiled. I had a terrible work ethic and I knew my college was going to be paid for regardless. Then the housing market collapsed in 2007. My mom lost her clients, her couple dozen investment houses she purchased, and had no income. She had to sell all of her material possessions, her young boyfriend left her, etc. She took her last $300,000 and opened a very niche store which failed after a year. She filed bankruptcy. I joined the military and left with $37 to my name. I had to learn work ethic. I had to learn how to learn. But overall, I've had a very successful career so far. My mom married a doctor to stay afloat, and still always talks about how she's going to make lots of money again to buy us all houses. Do you have a similar story? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.